You are looking at a bubbling jar that fed every civilization ever built. Egyptian pyramid builders, Roman legions, medieval villagers, all ate bread risen by this same living culture. No packets, no refrigeration, no store. In 1868, Louis Pasteur proved something with a single discovery that changed bread forever. 10 to 1. Understand that ratio, and you'll know exactly why modern bread has almost no connection to the food that nourished humanity for 5,000 years. That jar is a sourdough starter, a living ecosystem of wild yeast and bacteria passed from hand to hand for 5 millennia. It leavened every loaf until the 20th century, when a single invention erased it from kitchens overnight. What vanished wasn't just a method. It was a flavor, a texture, a nutrient profile that modern bread never recovered. And the story of how we lost it starts in ancient Egypt. In 1854, a Swiss archaeologist pulled a charred lump from the mud of Lake Biel. It was bread baked 5,600 years ago by a Neolithic farmer who had no oven and no yeast packet. But the real birthplace of leavened bread is a scorching floodplain where two things happened by accident. An Egyptian baker ground emmer wheat, mixed it with water, and left the paste sitting in a warm corner. Wild yeast spores drifting in the Nile air landed on that porridge and began to feed. The next morning, the paste had bubbled and swelled. He baked it anyway, and the result was lighter, taller, easier to chew than the flat discs his ancestors had eaten for millennia. The discovery transformed civilization. By the time of the Old Kingdom, 4,500 years ago, Egyptian bakers were producing dozens of bread varieties. Loaves were buried, with pharaohs to sustain them in the afterlife. Workers building the Great Pyramid of Giza received daily bread rations, leavened loaves that fueled the largest construction project in antiquity. The secret didn't stay on the Nile. Roman legions marched across Europe carrying sourdough starters in sealed pots. Each soldier received a daily grain ration they ground and baked themselves. Without commercial yeast, they relied on a portion of yesterday's dough to raise tomorrow's loaf. Where Rome conquered, their bread followed. The Latin word fermentum gave us both fermentation and the idea that a little piece of the past lives in every loaf. For the next 1,000 years, sourdough was not a choice. It was the only way anyone on the continent rose bread. Medieval bakers guarded their starters like a guild secret. A bride carried a crock of her mother's starter into her marriage as part of her dowry, a living inheritance more valuable than coin. In the monasteries of France and Germany, monks perfected the rhythm of feeding and baking, developing the tangy, complex flavors that would define regional breads for centuries. But in the 1700s, bakers noticed something. The foam skimmed from a vat of brewing beer, called barm, could raise a dough in half the time. By the late 18th century, Dutch merchants were selling compressed yeast cakes made from spent brewing yeast. They required no feeding, no daily care. For the first time, a baker could open a packet rather than tend a living culture. And that is where the trouble begins, because the pure, predictable yeast that would eventually push sourdough to the edge of extinction wasn't invented in a bakery. It was discovered in a glass flask by a man who never baked a loaf in his life. His name was Louis Pasteur, and what he found in 1857 would change bread forever. Pasteur was not trying to reinvent bread. In 1857, he was a dean of science at the University of Lille, investigating why vats of beet juice at a local distillery kept souring into a putrid, useless slime. He drew a sample from a healthy vat, placed it under his lens, and discovered an entire civilization invisible to the naked eye. Millions of microscopic living cells, each one a tiny globe with a transparent membrane, were feeding on sugar and releasing alcohol and gas. He called them ferments. And for the first time in human history, someone understood that fermentation was not a chementation, was not a chemical breakdown. It was a biological act. Life consuming life. That revelation rewired the food supply. Once brewers and bakers knew that yeast was a living organism, they could isolate a single strain, breed it in a sterile flask, and produce a pure powder that acted with the precision of a machine. No bacteria, no lactic acid, no wild unpredictability, just Saccharomyces cerevisiae alone. In 1868, the Fleischmann brothers, Charles and Maximilian, teamed up with a cashier named James Gaff and took Pasteur's laboratory science to the American kitchen. They built America's first compressed yeast factory in Cincinnati, and within a decade, the little foil-wrapped cake had killed the need for a bubbling crock of sourdough starter on the windowsill. A baker could mix flour, water, salt, and 1 cake of yeast, and the dough would double in under 2 hours. A sourdough loaf, by comparison, required 12 to 24 hours of patient fermentation. In the clanging new world of steam and steel, speed won. By the 1920s, a chemistry professor at the University of Minnesota named William Alton Gould introduced the first active dry yeast, a shelf-stable powder that could wait on the pantry shelf for months. The last barrier to complete dominance fell. You no longer needed a brewery down the street. You no longer needed a starter that demanded daily feedings. You just tore open a paper envelope, and as bread factories multiplied, the bakers who still kept a mother alive in a wooden bowl grew old and took their starters to the grave. But here is the thing: the yeast companies never put on the packaging. That long, slow fermentation they had replaced with a single fast-acting organism was not just about the rise. It was a chemical transformation that changed the very structure of the grain. Wild sourdough co-ferments with a vast army of lactic acid bacteria, and those bacteria break down phytic acid, an antinutrient in wheat that binds to minerals like iron, zinc, and magnesium and stops your body from absorbing them. They partially digest gluten proteins before the dough ever hits your stomach. A 2-hour yeast rise does almost none of that. The modern loaf rises fast, looks perfect, and leaves the hardest work to your own gut. That is the pivot nobody saw coming. The same technology that made bread faster, softer, and cheaper was quietly stripping away the nutritional scaffolding that had protected eaters for millennia. And the man who proved it was not a food historian or an artisan baker. He was a microbiologist in Belgium in the 1990s, staring at a set of lab results that the industrial bread world has spent 30 years hoping nobody would find. The microbiologist was Dr. Marc de Smet, working out of the food science laboratories at the University of Leuven. In 1991, he set up a simple experiment. He prepared 2 identical batches of whole wheat dough. One he fermented with commercial baker's yeast for 90 minutes, the industry standard. The other he fermented with a mature sourdough culture for 18 hours at a cool temperature, exactly as a medieval baker would have done overnight. Then he measured what remained of the mineral-blocking phytic acid in each loaf. The difference was not a percentage point or 2. The sourdough loaf had broken down 97% of the phytic acid. The yeast-only loaf had degraded barely a third. The bowl that moved slowly had unlocked iron, zinc, and magnesium that the fast bowl had locked away. The same grain, the same flour. A totally different nutritional event. De Smet's paper, published quietly in a Belgian food journal, should have been front-page news. It was not. What happened next made it worse. Subsequent research across Europe found that the lactic acid bacteria in a traditional starter were not merely breaking down anti-nutrients, they were rearranging the gluten proteins themselves. In a long sourdough fermentation, enzymes from the bacteria cleave the long peptide chains that trigger immune reactions in sensitive individuals. A study from the University of Bari in Italy in 2004 found that sourdough bread, fermented for 24 hours, contained less than 12 parts per million of residual gluten, low enough to be tolerated by most celiac patients in the trial. The same flour, made with fast yeast, sent those same patients into a cascade of inflammation. Nobody in the yeast aisle ever mentions that study either. And then the flavor researchers stepped in. Gas chromatography of sourdough crumb reveals over 50 distinct volatile compounds that do not exist in yeast-risen bread. Acetic acid gives the tang. Lactic acid gives the creamy roundness. Esters and alcohols that sound more like a wine tasting. Notes of honey, pineapple, even subtle floral notes from the specific wild yeast strains that live in the baker's kitchen. A fast yeast loaf produces maybe a dozen. Sourdough is not just bread. It is a microbial fingerprint of the place it was raised. A San Francisco starter tastes different from a Parisian levain, which tastes different from a rye mother kept warm in a German village. The terroir is alive, but the industry had no use for any of this. Speed, not complexity, drove the supply chain. By the 1950s, almost every commercial bakery in America had abandoned natural leavening entirely. A new process called the Corleywood bread process, invented in Britain in 1961, pushed the clock even harder. It used intense mechanical mixing, chemical oxidizers, and extra yeast to turn a batch of flour into a bagged loaf in 3.5 hours from start to finish. The crumb was cottony, the crust soft, the shelf life measured in weeks. It was cheap, and it was unlike anything a human being had eaten for 5,000 years. Here is the twist that nobody saw coming. As bread became softer, faster, and blander, rates of celiac disease, wheat allergy, and non-celiac gluten sensitivity began to climb. The medical community argued about diagnostics. The food industry insisted wheat was safe. But a quiet voice in the laboratories kept asking the question Pasteur would have asked. What if the problem is not the grain, but the disappearance of the fermentation that made it digestible? And there is one more detail they do not put on the supermarket label. When you see the word sourdough stamped on a plastic bag, odds are it contains 0 long fermented starter. It is commercial yeast dough spiked with citric acid, acetic acid, or dried sourdough powder to mimic the taste. Real sourdough takes time, and industrial bakeries do not schedule time. They schedule throughput. The Renaissance did not begin in a factory. It began in a garage in San Francisco, a farmhouse in Vermont, and a basement in Oslo, because some bakers realized that if they wanted the real thing, they would have to resurrect it themselves. And what one of them found inside a jar that had been sealed for over a century changed the entire debate. The baker was Dr. Ed Wood, a pathologist from Idaho who was not a professional baker at all. He had spent his career studying bacteria in a hospital lab, and when he retired, he turned his microscope toward an obsession: the lost starters of the world. In the late 1980s, he flew to Cairo and knocked on the door of a Bedouin family who had baked the same bread for generations. They gave him a sample of their starter, a beige, bubbling paste that had been fed by that family for over 100 years. He sealed the jar, flew it back to Idaho, and fed it. It lived. It produced a loaf that tasted like nothing sold in any American bakery. Then he went to Saudi Arabia, then to France, and then he heard about a jar sealed with wax that had sat in a Wyoming attic since 1891. The starter inside had been last fed by a homesteader named Mary Jane Matson, who had left it untouched when her family moved. The jar passed through 3 generations. When Wood cracked the seal and added flour and water, the dormant microbes woke within hours. A century of silence ended, and the bread that rose was the bread of the Oregon Trail. Wood's starters became the seed for an underground network. He published a book called World Sourdoughs from Antiquity, and bakers who had been searching mailed him empty jars and received a wet, living culture in return. By the late 90s, a quiet revival was burning in farmhouse kitchens and small bakeries from the Pyrenees to Portland. They weren't just reviving a recipe, they were rewilding the flour. Now, here is what the science has finally proven. A mature sourdough starter is not a single organism you can patent. It is a stable ecosystem with hundreds of distinct microbial species living in symbiosis. The wild yeast gives the rise, but the lactic acid bacteria, present at a ratio of roughly 100:1, do the heavy lifting for flavor and nutrition. That ratio Pasteur never saw, because his pure cultures isolated one cell and threw the rest away. The industry optimized for the soloist. Sourdough is the symphony they discarded. The good news is, unlike an Amish field or a petroleum patent, this knowledge cannot be locked behind a corporate paywall. You can start a sourdough starter tonight with 2 ingredients, flour and water, nothing else. The wild yeast and bacteria are already on the grain, in the air, on your hands. Mix equal parts flour and water, leave it on the counter, and feed it again tomorrow. In 5 to 7 days, it will bubble. It will smell like a bakery. It will be alive. That is the same process used in the shadow of the Great Pyramid, and it costs exactly as much as a scoop of flour. One final detail that changes everything. Researchers at the University of Helsinki found in 2019 that a starter fed daily for just 3 weeks develops enough microbial complexity to break down phytic acid to the same level as a 100-year-old mother. The learning curve is not a generation long, it is a single month. So the real question is not whether commercial yeast is easier. You already know it is. The real question is what you are willing to trade for that speed. We traded nutrition, digestibility, and 50+ flavors for a 90-minute rise. We traded a living inheritance for a paper packet. And for over 100 years, nobody told us the price. The price was paid in bread that tastes of nothing and a generation of eaters whose bodies don't recognize the grain. But the knowledge never died. It simply went quiet, waiting in a jar in an Idaho refrigerator, in a Bedouin tent, in the hands of a baker who decided slow was better. If you are the kind of person who believes that what we lost might be exactly what we need to reclaim, this content was made for you. And if it made sense, I've put together a resource for anyone ready to bring true fermentation back into their kitchen. The link is in the first pinned comment. It's how I say thank you. Hit like, subscribe if you haven't, and tell me in the comments, what forgotten food tradition should I investigate next? I read every single one, and your answers decide what we uncover. The Amish have a saying, we don't inherit the earth from our ancestors, we borrow it from our children. Maybe bread is the same. The starter you feed today is borrowed from the future. Keep it alive.